Trump has just put a 48-hour clock on one of the most dangerous choke points in the world. If Iran does not fully reopen the Strait of Hormuz, he says the United States will start hitting Iran's power plants, starting with the biggest one first. That is not rumor, and it is not internet exaggeration. That is the threat now sitting over the region. And that is exactly what this video is about, what Trump said, why power plants are suddenly on the table, why Hormuz matters so much, and why the next 48 hours could reshape not just this war, but the global economy. Because this is no longer only about missiles flying over Israel or strikes landing inside Iran. This is about whether the conflict is about to move directly into the infrastructure that keeps a modern state running. Electricity, fuel movement, water systems, refining, export terminals, command networks. If power plants become targets, the war enters a much more dangerous phase. According to Reuters, Trump said that if Iran does not fully open without threat the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours, the United States will hit and obliterate Iran's power plants, starting with the biggest one first. AP and BBC also reported the same basic ultimatum and the same central condition: reopen Hormuz, or face a new round of strikes focused on power infrastructure. So in the first 30 seconds, let's make this absolutely clear. Yes, the title is about a 48-hour ultimatum, and yes, the threat specifically involves Iranian power plants tied to the Strait of Hormuz crisis. Now step back and look at the timing, because that is what makes this so explosive. Barely a day earlier, Trump had been talking about possibly winding the war down. Then suddenly the language changed. Not softened, changed. A hard deadline, a direct demand, a named target category. That kind of shift matters because wars are not only escalated by troop movements. They're escalated by changing the target list, and power plants are not just another target. If you hit missile launchers, the message is military. If you hit radar, the message is tactical. If you threaten a country's power grid, the message is systemic. You're saying we can affect daily life, industrial output, fuel distribution, pumping systems, communications, and maybe even command reliability all at once. Reuters noted that Iran's power grid is deeply intertwined with its energy sector, meaning major strikes on key plants could trigger blackouts that affect everything from pumps and refineries to export terminals and military command centers. In other words, this is not just about turning the lights off, it is about stressing the entire machine underneath the state. That is why this ultimatum is so serious, because the Strait of Hormuz is not some random patch of water that only matters to the Gulf. It is one of the world's most critical energy choke points. Reuters says it carries around a fifth of global oil and liquefied natural gas supplies. BBC similarly frames it as a geographic bottleneck through which about 20% of the world's oil exports travel. AP describes it as a vital route for the global flow of oil, gas, and goods. So when Trump ties a military threat directly to Hormuz reopening, he is linking military escalation to global energy security in the clearest possible way. And that is where the real pressure begins. Because if this were only about punishing Iran, it would still be a major story. But this is bigger than punishment. This is coercion under a ticking clock. The demand is not vague. It is not de-escalate. It is not come back to the table. It is open the strait. That makes the next 48 hours a test of leverage, credibility, and political nerve. Now ask the next question. Why power plants? Why not oil fields? Why not ports? Why not military depots? The answer may be strategic calibration. Reuters quotes an analyst arguing that targeting power infrastructure could make the blockade economically and politically unbearable for Tehran without destroying oil fields in a way that causes long-term global supply damage. That distinction matters. If you target oil production too directly, you risk damaging the very supply system the global economy depends on. But if you target electricity feeding the broader energy system, you can create pressure without necessarily wiping out long-term resource capacity. At least, that appears to be the theory. Temporary paralysis instead of permanent supply loss, pressure instead of scorched earth energy disruption. But here is the problem. In practice, infrastructure wars do not stay neat for long because power plants are not isolated military gadgets sitting in empty deserts. They are part of civilian life. Hospitals depend on them, water systems depend on them, transport depends on them. Industry depends on them. BBC's coverage notes that targeting such sites carries serious legal and moral questions because power infrastructure is generally treated as civilian in nature due to its importance to the wider population. So even if the stated logic is strategic pressure, the consequences could radiate far beyond the battlefield. That is what makes this feel less like a routine escalation and more like a threshold moment. Because once a war moves from military capability to state functionality, the entire risk map changes, and Iran is not staying quiet about that risk either. Reuters reports that Iran warned it would target U.S. infrastructure. including energy facilities in the Gulf, if Trump carries out the threat. AP says Iranian statements specifically pointed to U.S. and Israeli energy and infrastructure assets in the region, including information technology and desalination facilities. Think about what that means for a second. We are no longer talking only about military bases or launch sites. We are talking about the systems that keep Gulf economies and cities alive. Energy, water, data. That is a much wider and more dangerous ladder of escalation. And this is where viewers need to understand the regional geometry. The Gulf is not just a battlefield backdrop, it is the economic nervous system of the global energy market. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Kuwait, all of them sit inside a space where one infrastructure shock can echo globally within hours. Reuters warns that markets are already on edge, with one analyst calling Trump's ultimatum a 48-hour ticking time bomb of elevated uncertainty over global markets. Oil had already surged to its highest levels in years, and European gas prices had jumped sharply after the near closure of Hormuz. That means this is not some distant regional flare-up. The economic consequences are already spreading outward. That is why this story is so powerful on YouTube too, because it combines three things that hold audience attention all the way through. A hard countdown, a huge target set, and consequences that reach beyond the battlefield. 48 hours, power plants. 1/5 of the world's oil and LNG route. That is the hook. But the deeper story is even more important. This ultimatum also reveals something about the state of the war itself. BBC describes the conflict as entering a fuzzy phase of mixed messages and uncertainty. That wording matters, because the United States is sending one message through movement, and another through rhetoric. On one hand, there has been talk of winding things down. On the other, Marines and heavy landing craft are still heading into the region, according to Reuters, and the target list is expanding in public. That contradiction creates danger all by itself. It makes allies nervous, it encourages adversaries to test resolve, and it leaves markets guessing which statement is policy and which is pressure. And allies matter here more than many people realize. Reuters notes that some U.S. allies remain reluctant to join a wider war that Washington escalated without fully consulting them. Trump has also criticized allies over the burden of reopening Hormuz. That matters because military power is one thing, coalition management is another. If the United States threatens strikes that could trigger retaliation across Gulf infrastructure, every regional partner and every nervous ally now has to ask the same question. Are we prepared for what comes after the first hit on a major power plant? And if the answer is uncertain, that itself becomes a strategic weakness. Now stay with me, because this next part is where the story turns from dramatic to potentially historic. AP reported that Iranian missiles also struck two southern Israeli cities near the country's main nuclear research center area, with Dimona and Arad seeing serious damage and injuries. AP further said Israel's military was not able to intercept the missiles that hit those areas, describing it as the first time Iranian missiles had penetrated defenses in that area. The UN nuclear watchdog said it had not received reports of damage to the research center itself or abnormal radiation levels, but the symbolism is obvious. While Washington threatens Iran's power infrastructure, Iran is showing it can still reach highly sensitive zones in Israel. That is escalation by message, not just by blast radius. So both sides are now doing more than striking. They are signaling. Trump's signal is this: reopen Hormuz or face deeper infrastructure pain. Iran's signal is this: if you widen the war, the region's most sensitive systems are all in play, and once both sides start talking like that, the conflict becomes less about the last strike and more about who blinks first. That is why the next 48 hours are not just a countdown to a possible military action. They are a countdown to a test of credibility. If Iran does not fully reopen Hormuz, what does Trump do? If Trump does nothing, the ultimatum looks weaker than the language that launched it. If Trump acts, Iran has already suggested, the retaliation will not be limited to one corner of the map. And that is why this moment is so dangerous. Not because war in the Middle East is new, it is not, but because a U.S. president has now publicly tied a short deadline to attacks on core civilian-linked infrastructure in a state whose response capacity has not disappeared. That is not normal escalation. That is compressed escalation. And compressed escalation is where miscalculation thrives. One ship movement, one missile launch, one blackout, one retaliatory strike on Gulf infrastructure, one market panic when trading opens. That is all it takes for this story to jump from breaking news into global crisis territory. So what should viewers really watch now? First, watch Hormuz traffic itself. Reuters and AP both indicate that transit is not simply normal or closed. It is becoming selective, politically filtered, and unstable. That means even partial movement is not the same as restored confidence. Second, watch whether Washington changes the target list again. Once power plants are named publicly, the escalation ladder has already moved up, even before any strike happens. Third, watch Iran's regional posture. If Tehran is serious about responding to energy facility strikes with attacks on American-linked infrastructure, then Gulf states will immediately become central to the story, not peripheral to it. And fourth, watch markets, because sometimes markets recognize danger before governments admit how serious it is. In the end, this is the real meaning of Trump's 48-hour ultimatum. It is not just a threat against power plants. It is an attempt to force a strategic reversal under extreme time pressure at one of the most vital energy choke points on Earth. That is why the story matters. That is why the title matters. And that is why the next 48 hours could tell us whether this war is still being managed or whether it is starting to outrun the people leading it. If Trump follows through, the war enters a new infrastructure phase. If he backs off, the credibility cost will be immediate. If Iran yields, it loses leverage at the exact point where it still holds global attention. If Iran refuses, the pressure on Washington to act becomes much harder to avoid. That is the trap now. A threat big enough to change the war, tied to a deadline short enough to make mistakes more likely. 48 hours, one choke point, a threat against the power behind the power, and a region waiting to see whether this was the final warning, or the opening line of something even bigger.